Hello and welcome back to another EDH Deck Tech video. Today I'm going to be going over one of my 3 Xantcha decks. Xantcha Sleeper Agent here is a brand new legendary from this year's Commander set. And this is a character that I've always loved. Like, I have a casual 60 card deck built around Sleeper Agent. This is my favorite Vanguard to play. Xantcha's character and story is beautiful, and the amount of effort put into creating this card, the design, is very apparent. Even if you zoom in on the original artwork here done by Mark, you can even see a small heart in her hand. A very beautiful card. I'm going to try to stick away from the actual Vorthos nonsense and talk about this as a card and commander, because as a Timmy and someone who loves the storyline, I can go on tangents. Let's stick with the actual card and the deck. So Xantcha, Sleeper Agent, is a 3-mana 5/5, a very stellar size comparison, but unfortunately you can never attack with her unless something wrong has happened. She comes into play under an opponent's control. Now this does not mean that you cannot get her back. If someone has something like a Homeward Path, or they randomly run the card a Brand, which may be in like a Zedra deck or something like that, she will come into play, and it's like the clone effect. As it comes into play, it will go to someone else. She will never actually be in play on your side unless some other effect has caused it to return to you. Now, she has to attack each combat if able, and she cannot attack me or Planeswalker I control, or the owner of the card, that is. Now, this is good and bad. Good that you will not be able to be hit by your own Xantcha. Bad, depending on, number one, the volume of opponents and the size of your opponent's creatures. There are a lot of tech I see people talking about for Xantcha, making her combat efficient, protecting her in combat, making her do Voltron damage or commander damage. And personally, that may work for some more casual groups. The stronger your groups become, the less appealing Xantcha becomes. And let's continue on down here. Her third ability is another infinite mana win condition. 3 colorless mana. This creature makes the controller lose 2 life, and the person who pays this ability draws a card. As this is the second Rakdos infinite mana commander, the first being Lizolda the Blood Witch, which is one of the pilots of my World Gorger Dragon deck. The biggest difference between this and Lizolda, who goes infinite by casting herself infinitely and shocking and drawing everyone to death. Lizolda requires a black and red mana per activation of that cycle. Thus, for 3 opponents at 40 life, you would have to have 60 red and 60 black mana. Xantcha here requires colorless to activate. Now, there's lots of fun tech and everything I've seen people playing with. This is my current brew around it. Again, I don't think, yes, 3 mana 5/5 is very good. It's nice to pump her out early sometimes. Relying on her attacking is not optimal. It's just very frequent in this format, especially in this color restriction, that your opponents will have a bigger and better creature she will run straight into. Sometimes, again, this is another commander that's overexposure to this commander can also educate the opponents of how she works. Thus, people will just gang up on her. She's also very vulnerable to sacrifice effects, which is incredibly common in this format. So, this is probably one of the most intricately designed, I can feel the effort from development put into this card. One of the most intricately designed Rakdos commanders, probably one of the most interesting ones. And while it seems very powerful, and yes, it has infinite possibilities, this is not a strong commander. And I am a Rakdos and Mono Red fanboy, and I'm saying point blank that this Rakdos still does not have an edge in competitive EDH. This is a very good step forward. World Gorger Dragon combo with Lizolda was a very strong and powerful deck. I still have it. I'm actually playing with Xantcha in that deck too now as an alternative commander. But that susceptibility to being blown out is scary. This is a very good step away from that, because you don't have to rely on World Gorger Dragon to get infinite mana. But as a competitive standpoint, this is a very good step forward. It's not quite up to tier with CEDH level, but this is still a very strong commander. Now, I'm going to go and show the basic parts of this deck for what the deck's functions are. Then we'll go by card type. So obviously, she wins with infinite mana. This deck has 2.5 ways of generating infinite mana. The obvious one being Rings of Bright Hearth, and Basalt Monolith. This is German, ignore the language. So, again, if you're unfamiliar with this interaction, this is a 3 mana costing artifact. It taps for 3 colorless mana. It has an activated ability of paying 3 to untap it. This is an artifact that you can pay 2 colorless to double an activated ability. You cannot double mana abilities. So you tap this for 3 mana, and you can use that same 3 mana to then immediately untap it. But if you had 2 extra mana, you could double this untap step. So you would tap it for mana, you would use the mana to untap it. With that trigger to untap on the stack, you would pay 2 to have a double of the untap. The untap resolves, the copy of the untap resolves, you tap it again for more mana. The original untap resolves. You have +1 colorless mana, and you can continue doing this infinitely to make infinite colorless mana. Rings is a generically good card that interacts with a lot of cards in this deck. If you have Planeswalkers or fetch lands or just about anything with activated abilities, very good. You can even pay 2 to copy her ability to save 1 mana if you really need to. The second infinite mana part is not good. This is not a combo I actually enjoy. I'm just playing with it because it seems decent enough here. Is Reiterate and Mana Geyser. This is a very mana intensive combo. It requires 11 mana to get going, 4 of which has to be red. How this works is you cast your 5 mana spell. While it's on the stack, you retain priority. With 6 mana, you use Reiterate with buyback to make a copy of Mana Geyser. Assuming that your opponents have 7 or more lands tapped, then you would generate a copy of Mana Geyser, get 7 mana from the copy. This would be back in your hand, ready to go again, because you would then start generating additional mana. Again, the issue being 11 mana to jumpstart this combo. You only get red mana. Again, that you have to have black somewhere. And your opponents have to have a cumulative 7 lands tapped. So this is a casual infinite mana combo for very late games, or if you have just a ridiculous start of mana rocks. I would recommend this in most groups. If your groups play a bunch of extremely strong decks, don't try it. Next, we have, I said, there's a half combo, and that is Paradox Engine. I keep plugging this in a lot of decks for generic utility. This is not a dedicated Paradox Engine deck. It does have a bunch of mana rocks, but Xantcha doesn't always need infinite mana to be good. You just keep drawing cards, and what really works well with Paradox Engine is just playing cards. So yeah, you can go pseudo-infinite. Another part of this that I have been playing with is an original structure I built into one of my Storm decks, which was Null Profusion and Paradox Engine, again with just a few mana rocks. You can start chaining through your deck very efficiently. And of course, this interaction gets very stupid with Sensei's Top, because if you have a few mana rocks out, every card you draw, you can keep putting top on top, cast the top for free, and keep digging down, and using floating mana to keep filtering. This is not an infinite combo. This is just a very good interaction of cards, and it usually does end the game. And before we go on to the rest of the cards, again, Xantcha is very good, but sometimes your commander gets bricked. There's a lot. For example, the precons that came out this year. I'm going to try very hard not to rant on this year's precons. But there's an Enchantress precon, and you're going to run into things like Faith Fetters. You run her out, she's going to get turned off. Your deck has to have some other way of winning. And of course, you can do that with a big pile of big X spells. This is a deck that actually runs Fireball. This probably needs to be something like Starstorm. No, that's a bad one. Basically X spells. Because a giant mana development deck, these are the cards that can win. Commune is interesting. This will help us dig, especially if we have a bunch of mana. Another thing I do need to point out, Xantcha requires you to draw a card. If you have 3 opponents, and yes, you make infinite mana, but your deck has less than 60 cards, you cannot use Xantcha to win the game. And this is also a little tricky sometimes when you use Commune. A card I have that I have not plugged in here yet is Damnable Pact, which is an X black. Target player draws X and loses X. That's going to be in this deck shortly. I just keep forgetting. But these effects are very good with a lot of mana, but you cannot then use Xantcha to win the game if you don't have enough cards in your deck. My deck has some Eldrazi and a Faithless Looting, so I can try to get rid of them. But again, that's not always an option. You have to be real. It's kind of like when you play Niv Mizzet, the combo Niv Mizzet. You can't always just win with Curiosity or something on him, because you have to kind of build around that. But we have Commune with Lava to get us some big value. We have Comet Storm, Exsanguinate, and Torment of Hailfire. These are the alternative win conditions, sometimes mid-game spells, just to get some value going. Now let's set Xantcha off to the side. I will go through the rest of the deck. I will try to keep it by card type for now on and through here. And when there are relevant cards, again, there's a lot of talk about what cards people play with her for relevance. I will point them out as we go. So there's very few creatures in this deck. Other than Xantcha, we have 7. We have Magus the Wheel as a placeholder till I get another Wheel of Fortune. Sometimes it's actually good to have a nice blocker. Again, an issue here with Xantcha is if you're down to one opponent, you cannot effectively attack that opponent with ground creatures because they can't attack you and they will have a 5/5 defender for all time. So ground-based creatures may not be good if your opponents tend to die early, or if you tend to play more 1v1. She is probably not that good of a commander unless you have a 0 creature density deck. We have the generic ramp ones. Again, this is the hardest part for black-red as a combination. We have reliance on artifact mana and what few bits we get. So we have Solemn and Burnished Heart. We have a pair of Gearhawks. These are here again for generic value, good removal spell, some life gain, and a nice draw effect usually. And we have a pair of Eldrazi. And again, this is here because it's a big mana deck. These guys could be cast, but realistically, these are here for a Faithless Looting. So we can discard them if we're going infinite with Xantcha, so we don't deck ourselves. And that's, again, something that will happen if games go long and you draw too many cards. Let's go through the biggest complement of this deck, which is spells. This whole stack here is spells. We've already talked about the infinite mana combo here and the X spells. Let's just get those out of the way. Now, the next part here is kind of whimsical. Xantcha, again, is something that you may want to cast early just to get some cheap damage off. Because if she swings in for 5 and hits a few people, I would not build this with a goal of having her do commander damage. I would build this with the goal of having her come out early and chipping them away so you have to pay less activations to kill them. So having some spot removal to kill the creature that may be threatening to block Xantcha is pretty relevant. Now I may actually, this is something I will be changing again too. I'm thinking about dropping the Fireball, for example, to pick up a Hero's Downfall, maybe a Runus Path or something like that. Dreadbore being a sorcery is good and bad. Like Planeswalker removal for 2 is always good. This is a deck that suffers against Planeswalkers since we don't have the ability to directly attack them. So again, Hero's Downfall needs to be in this deck, and it will be soon. We have a Braid for some utility, artifact or small creature, Vandal Blast, and Pillage for lands. Things that make Xantcha fail could be something like a Glacial Chasm, or if you're trying to rely on combat, even something like the Maze of Vith or something like that. Stone Rain could be in here, something else like that, if that is more prevalent in your meta. Then we have some creature wipes. We have the Toxic Deluge because it's the most cost efficient. Fire Covenant could be in here too if you have a different style of deck with more life pay. We have Damnation Decree. And we have 3 kind of whimsical cards that, again, these may be replaced. I like Praetor's Grasp because depending on what the opponents play, I can almost always get some good utility. If they're playing like Mass Land Destruction, I can get their Crucible, I can get their Gilded Lotus to try to chain off with some kind of Paradox nonsense. I can get removal spells, reanimation spells, whatever I need. This is probably the one that will stay because it's a good utility card. These 2, although I'm playing with because they're fun, now there's a ruling here that you may need to verify, but I think how it works, Thrilling Encore puts onto the battlefield under my control all creatures put into graveyard. Now, this is a little sketch when something specifically says it comes into play under someone else's control. Does this override this? I'm going to have to check that out. My understanding is this card specifically says this card comes into play under my control. But I don't know if this overrides it. I'm going to have that verified. But these are cute little instant interactions. This deck likes to kill creatures, and people like to kill Xantcha. People like to board wipe in EDH. So sometimes you have a 5-mana rebuy all. Sometimes you just get a good value. Typically, I actually just use these for generic value if someone kills a Solemn Simulacrum, for example, because this deck just wins with mana. We have, again, Faithless Looting is a sneaky, important card here. Good for early game filtering and flashback. But this is used to get the Eldrazi out of our hand if we are drawing big with Xantcha. We have Acton Impulse. This needs to actually become like a wild guess or something like that. This is a good draw 3. Again, a good piece that goes with like the Paradox Engine nonsense. We have Knight's Whisper and Sign in Blood. Again, wild guess is supposed to be there in place of these. Read the Bones, another option if I had more colorful rocks like a dark steel ingot or something to guarantee a third color, then you could also do the one with Converge. Painful Truths, I think. We have a Vampiric Tutor, a few tutors here. Again, we're a combo deck. We need a few pieces to put together just to win. But of course, if we don't already see a piece in hand, sometimes it's better to just get generically good cards. And of course, we are a black-red deck. While we suffer against a lot of things, we do excel at some things, specifically creature removal and reanimation. Graveyard shenanigans are very good for black-red. We have Yogg-Will, again, to rebuy our graveyard. We have a Beacon, because this hits artifacts. This is actually the relevance of this card being in the deck. 5 mana, sorcery speed, creature recursion, not so good. But being able to pull back like Basalt Monolith or Rings or Paradox or something relevant is very good. And we have Rise because it's a generic win more. This is a deck I'm actually thinking about taking Rise out of. I am just tired of big mana spells that end the game. Like, I personally loathe Insurrection, Expropriate. I don't like cards like that. And this is a card it's generically good and it doesn't fit the theme of the deck, so I'm thinking about taking it out. Talking about themes of the deck, let's go through the artifacts next. Now, as I said, I love thematic cards, and I love things that reference Xantcha. So, my absolute favorite card in this deck, it's not good, it's not like competitive, it doesn't actually make the deck a lot stronger. It's Hearthstone. In theory, by the time stamping of the Stronghold set and the Urza block where the story was built and all that, this is not an unofficial Heart of Xantcha. Again, I'm not going to go in the story. I love the book. I can rant at length about the book some flavor. But flavorfully, this, I'm fairly certain, is Xantcha's Heart, the one that makes into Karn. And this is actually probably the most thematic and powerful card to go with Xantcha when you're mixing theme and power, being that it drops her ability from 3 mana to 1. Or to 2, sorry. So 3 mana to draw a card is not always very appealing to people in EDH. That's a lot of mana. But if you drop it to 2, then that's essentially a pseudo-greed or something like that, or an Urbos. Everyone has a variant of Urbos where the opponent that has this loses the life. You know what's better than 1 Hearthstone? 2 Hearthstones. If you drop Xantcha's ability to 1 single mana, that becomes the dream sequence of everyone will gang up and kill the person with Xantcha. There's a lot of problems with this because people will be drawing a lot of cards, and we're not the best deck suited to deal with people drawing a bunch of cards. You could build Xantcha in a Staxy discard style deck to make people want to use this ability. You know what happens when you do that? People kill Xantcha. Again, that's meta-specific. It may work for your group. In my group, which is fairly strong, this is a strong interaction. It's probably not strong enough, but I'm still running it because this is beautifully flavorful. And again, if you haven't had a chance, find the artwork, the original artwork by Mark here. You can go to Google search and just type Xantcha Mark Winners and zoom in, and you'll see in her hands right there is a heart, which I'm fairly certain is this. Going on through the rest of the artifacts, again, we have a Sensei's Top, because we have a Paradox Engine and a Null Perfusion. Null Perfusion specifically is a very fun version. It's Recycle. Again, Recycle is an old mono green card. It is Null Perfusion for 6 mana, the exact same card, and it combos beautifully with Sensei's Top if you have mana to work with. We also have Expedition Map. As a black-red deck that wants a bunch of mana, as you would expect, we have Cabal Coffers and Urborg and Deserted Temple in this deck. We will get there shortly. Let's go on through the mana rocks and the other artifacts. So again, there's a fairly high volume, the most important being Basalt Monolith. Unless you are threatened to lose a card in your hand due to your opponent like wheeling or having their own Magus the Wheel or playing targeted discard at random or something like that, you do not cast this card. This is held up in your hand until the last possible moment because, as I said, Xantcha is the kind of commander that becomes known. Your opponents begin to realize the plays and the sequencing. Like, if you do or do not cast Xantcha early, your opponents eventually realize why you do or do not cast Xantcha early, and they begin to predict what is in your hand. Same thing. They will eventually learn why Basalt Monolith is used in this deck. don't use it as a generic mana rock unless your hand is vulnerable to being destroyed. And even then, you may not want to cast Basalt Monolith if someone is playing like Return to Dust or something like that that could exile this permanent. Sometimes you want to try to wing getting the Yawgmoth's Will or Beacon so you can buy something back from your graveyard instead. We have the Rings, as we mentioned, is a generically good card. This, again, combos with so much. We've already saw the Expedition map and Xantcha, but there's other things this combos with too. This is a very underrated card. I don't know why this card has not spiked in price with all the other buyouts, especially in EDH, when even this turned a fetch land. If you crack a fetch land with this, and you pay 2 mana, every single fetch land with 2 mana up becomes like a rampant growth. And I don't know if a lot of people understand that value in non-green decks, especially in a color combination like Rakdos that hurts for a long-term effects like that. Criminally underrated card. We have a Paradox Engine. Again, this is not a dedicated Paradox Engine deck. If you like to see something like that, check out like my Gwendolyn deck. There's a few videos back, like a few months ago. Dedicated Paradox Engine decks typically run a bunch of tutors. They run blue, so you can Whir of Invention this into play and save it with counterspells, and you can also do things like Tezzeret the Seeker puts it right into play, and you use buyback spells usually to win the game with. But we have a bunch of mana rocks. We have the Mana Crypt and the Bauble, not quite a mana rock, but a decent turn 1 play. We have Soul Ring and a Mana Vault. We have the colorful ones. These are very important, specifically the Signet, because it is something that if we're very tight on colorless mana and we're trying to just plug Xantcha and we don't have anything but colorless mana, we can take that one colorless and turn it into 2 black-red. There's a land that does the same thing we're getting to, but this is probably the most relevant mana rock other than like one of the other ones coming up here. We have my favorites in the 2-drop diamonds. Again, these are casual. These are not good in competitive play. 2-drop rocks should be Felwar Stone or something that can immediately give you mana. I have a preference. We have Mind Stone to rebuy stuff later. Again, a card that could be in here, should be in here, is like Commander Sphere. 3-drop rocks, not so good. And again, this is a commander that actually you may want to consider investing in fast mana, like a Chrome Mox or even a Jeweled Amulet, because that allows for a turn 2 Xantcha. If your goal is to have more combat, more swinging 5/5s, then you would want a 0-drop Accelerant, something that can get her on turn 2. Simian Spirit Guide or Jeweled Amulet, the Mox, the ones you can play in this format, that can allow that if your deck wants a turn 2 Xantcha. This deck does not care. This deck does not want Xantcha in play until it can make best use of it. We have Grim Monolith for some more quick mana, Guild Lotus, and a new one in Coveted Jewel. I'm very much on the fence on this card. I love the card in the deck when I have things like Paradox Engine going off because it refills my hand. The problem with this deck is I have a whopping 7 creatures total in the deck I could block with. None of them fly. 2 of them are in Eldrazi. So defensively, this card is very whimsical if you don't do it post-board wipe, or if you yourself don't have the ability to effectively block. You're going to give this away very quickly. But if you're a combo deck that runs Paradox Engine and a bunch of big mana spells, and you just need some draw 3, this is very good. Currently, I'm thinking this card is about 45 to 55, like 45% good, 55% bad. It's leaning towards the more bad than good, simply from the level of experience of my opponents. Everyone sees this card and how easy it is to take advantage of it. And that's, again, against stronger opponents. You can also use this politically. If you know the person to your immediate left is going to attack you and try to take it, then you can do that, because that means the person to that person's left is then going to try to take it from them. And it can bounce around. Of course, people don't always like seeing that. So if there's someone to your right that can destroy this, they may just destroy this before anyone else can take advantage of it, because a control player doesn't like multiple opponents drawing extra cards. And let's go on through the few enchantments here. There is Null Profusion. I love this card. I have built many a deck around Null Profusion and Recycle. Recycle being the original version of this, being a 4-mana green. Again, the way this works, you can override the last bad part if you drop Spellbook, Reliquary Tower, or Thought Vessel after this in play. It's a timing restriction. So something that says your maximum hand size is 2 may not actually matter. In this deck, it also doesn't usually matter because we don't want to expose this to removal until we're about to go off. We hold this up until we have the mana to abuse it, and then we try to win that turn. But another thing a lot of people miss, when you play a card, you draw a card. It doesn't say cast. So if you put a card like a land from your hand into play, you draw a card. Your land's cantrip. And that is very good. So when, like, for example, if you cannot win on the turn this comes out, then you would just basically try to hold up what you need. Discard down, try not to hold on to lands. Yes, they cantrip, but you're probably going to draw a land. This also works very good with Yawgmoth's Will because when you play a card, it doesn't say you played the card from your hand. You draw a card. And of course, skipping your draw step hurts sometimes, but if you're playing this correctly, that doesn't matter. Again, more flavor. This is not flavorful to Xantcha in any way, shape, or form, but this is actually Ixidor in the plane shift. Again, that's another sequence of books. That's where the Red Chroma came from when he was stranded in a desert. Very interesting story. We have another flavorful card. This does not directly flavor with Xantcha. My personal opinion, she should have been an artifact creature, like an artifact minion. Because, again, I know what her history is. Again, trying very hard not to branch on that. This is a deck tech, not a Vorthos video. But this can make her an artifact. You can make her a 6/6 that you can wipe the rest of the creatures. Again, a lot of tech I've seen in Xantcha decks are ways to destroy all the creatures but Xantcha. You can do things like Languish. All creatures get -4, -4. Or Anger of the Gods. Smaller, menial board wipes. That is specific to your playgroup. If your playgroup has a bunch of tiny creatures, sure, go for that. My playgroup doesn't. My playgroup likes to Pterodactyl and Craterhoof and Maelstrom Wonder, and they like the big shit that kills me real fast. So that will not work for my playgroup. What does work is if you make her an artifact and this somehow survives for a turn cycle and she then is the sole survivor. This is also a bit of graveyard hate. I love the fact that a lot of people forget that. Like, that really screws up a lot of people. The first and second ability is all people usually read and care about. The third ability, by the third turn, this thing's been in play, people have forgotten. And then all of a sudden you wipe the lands player. A very good card for 4 mana. We have 2 bits of reanimation. Again, this is what black and red decks can accelerate out, specifically black. So we have to have the good stuff. If you wanted to build a stronger, more efficient combo deck with more tutors and fast mana, you would be replacing shit like this. And the last bit of the deck is this giant selection of lands. 2 very important cards that people are not talking about in regards to Xantcha are the Geyser and the Xantcha. Again, I've tried not to plug any Xantcha-specific combat tricks in my deck, but these are in your lands, which make them very good. So you can make Xantcha have First Strike or Fear. These can target a legendary creature you do not control, thus it can target Xantcha. These can also become politically savvy if you're trying to make bargains with your opponents. Sometimes in a deck that can't defend itself with a bunch of creatures, you turn into the game of politics and you have to find ways of surviving. These are fun ways of doing so. And of course, these are really the only ways in the deck other than spot removal to try to protect Xantcha. And realistically, if you're trying to spend your mana to protect Xantcha, why don't you just spend the mana to draw cards off Xantcha to develop your own way of winning the game? Off tangent. We have, again, Cabal Coffers. This is a big mana deck. A bunch of X spells, Meldorazi, and Xantcha. You don't have to have infinite mana to win. You just have to have a bunch of mana. And Cabal Coffers is a good way of doing that. We have the Urborg and a Deserted Temple to go with the Coffers. This is a deck that I'm considering putting a Grim Return and a Crucible of Worlds and a few like Wasteland Strip Mine effects in because Coffers gets blown up. But my deck also has 2.5 ways of making infinite mana, or a lot of mana, so it doesn't need Coffers. I'm on the fence about that. I will be playing this. I played this nonstop. Basically, as soon as I got this, and I started brewing around it a few days later, and it's just, yeah. I will continue testing. We have a budget fetch land that can get non-basic fetches. We have fetchable targets. Evolving Wilds, Mirrored Landscape, Ancient Tomb, and a Bloodstained Mire. The Bloodstained and the Rocky can get, of course, the Canyon Slaw, Smoldering Marsh, and a Blood Crypt. We have probably one of the secretly more important dual lands. Just like Rakdos Signet, if you are trying to combo with infinite mana very early with Xantcha, the hardship is getting the additional black-red. So yeah, you could be drawing a bunch of mana rocks, but what if you miss on those mana rocks and you just have colorless mana and you can't recast Xantcha? Well, if you haven't played your land for a turn, this is the fix. This one land is like a filter land. It's better in the sense of this combo than Graven Cairns because it takes colorless to activate and you get the black-red out of it to recast Xantcha and give it to another opponent or to continue doing whatever. We have City of Brass that should not be in the deck. This is probably going to just be something else. We have Sulphur Springs, the Command Tower. Basically, the other colorful fixable lands. This, again, is a very whimsical card. This is in here because I have an Urborg and 8 basic swamps. And, of course, 3 other non-basic swamps. But this is one of the worst color-fixing lands. It usually is a waste. We have a Dragon Skull Summit. And, of course, 8 basic mountains, 8 basic swamps. And there we go. And we're back to Xantcha. That is my current active deck list. This is not, it is a combo deck. It is not a dedicated combo deck. Otherwise, you would see things like more fast mana, Mox. You would see things like Wheel of Fortune, Reforge the Soul to refill your hand. You would see things like interaction, like, even things like a Defense Grid would fit in this deck. If you wanted a competitive combo Xantcha style deck, that is possible. And of course, the issue being the color of black-red is not exactly the best for competitive EDH, but you can make a damn good deck. I love Xantcha. Like, again, I've been harping on me trying not to vent the Vorthos, but this is one of my favorite characters from old storylines. I still maintain a 60-card casual deck built around Sleeper Agent, the original Xantcha. The combo is, of course, Darkest Hour and Light of Day, making non-black, thus all creatures unattackable. It's like a little insubordination, open wounds kind of deck. I love Vanguard, and whenever I play Vanguard, I either use Xantcha or Gix. And I'm very happy. Personally, I'm not going to hate and rant on the Commander 2018 decks too hard. My biggest gripe is that this is a non-foil rare. While cards like the Spider and the Hydra were given mythic status and foiling, there's a lot of opinions I'm going to retain here for this. Now, luckily, if you guys keep up with Judge Foils and printings, every year they usually give at least one of the random commanders from the commander set a foil printing. For example, they gave it to Carador, they gave it to, what's the mono red guy that reanimates things from your graveyard? Feldon. They gave it to Feldon. Every year, they will go and make